Waverly Knobs Entertainment presents the Branch Out Podcast with your hosts Evan Charles Anderson and Tatiana Ivan. We discuss all the exciting facets of digital media and marketing for businesses and professionals. Our goal is to empower you so you can increase your knowledge, engagement, and brand identity. Let's get ready to branch out. Thank you for listening to Branch Out, the digital media and marketing podcast with Evan Charles Anderson and Tatiana Ivan. Hope you're having a fantastic day today. We're really excited for this episode because we have the Can Man, that's right, the Can Man, Charles Smith, who is cannabis regulatory consultant and criminal defense lawyer. He specializes in guiding companies through the complex regulatory process in regulated cannabis markets. Also, he's part of the advisory board of New York Cannabis Alliance, a member of the New York City Bar Association Committee on Drugs and the Law, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, the Drug Policy Alliance, the National Cannabis Industry Alliance, and a lifetime member of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, aka NORML, and National Cannabis Bar Association, aka he wears a lot of friggin' hats and has a lot of friggin' memberships. Whew. Now that I've gotten my warm-up for speaking today, how are you doing today, Charles?
I am doing great. I am happy to be here chatting with you guys. Great way to spend an afternoon, certainly.
So, Charles, walk us through your professional journey. Have you always been interested in law? What prompted also the focus on cannabis consultancy and criminal defense?
Sure. So my professional journey begins in New York, where I went to law school, and I worked for the city of New York for a couple of years after law school. It wasn't really something that was so inspiring and motivating to me, and ultimately I went off on my own and started my own criminal defense firm. And a colleague of mine from law school, who is a criminal defense attorney himself, suggested that I look into the NORML legal committee as a way to generate business, and that involved becoming a member of the organization, as Evan mentioned, and then there was an email listserv and a listing online, and essentially that's what brought me to cannabis. I had been a cannabis consumer prior to that, but it hadn't been something that really inspired me. And as I learned more and more about cannabis, I started reading voraciously about the issue and reading case law, as well as all of the newsletters and other mediums where I could learn about cannabis. I started going to conferences, and ultimately I realized, wait a second, maybe I should just be working in cannabis rather than practicing criminal defense. And so I moved out to Colorado and immersed myself in the legal cannabis industry. This was in the winter of 2013, kind of just before regulated cannabis came into play in Colorado. And then I spent the majority of 2014 doing consulting work in Colorado and seeing firsthand what a regulated cannabis market was like. And I guess the rest is history. I moved back east and started doing more cannabis consulting, and I certainly always had been interested in law. And if you had asked me when I was kind of practicing criminal defense as my sole focus, I would have said if you had asked me this very same question, I would have said there's nothing else I could ever picture myself doing. I certainly always liked arguing with people and crafting arguments, and in law school really enjoyed that kind of academic part of law. Unfortunately, the practice of law is very dissimilar from law school, as well as Law and Order or any of the Dick Wolf TV shows that your listeners might watch. I really think that's what drew me more to cannabis, was the opportunity to move away from the business of law into a emerging market such as cannabis. And then ultimately, to me, it's an issue of social justice. The reason why I was focused on criminal defense was, yes, certainly I wanted to make a living, but I also wanted to help people. And I find in cannabis that I'm able to effectuate more social change through the industry and changing laws than I ever was able to do in the courtroom representing the interests of one individual.
I have a question that I think I've had for a long time, and perhaps some of our listeners do too, but what is the difference, or, when somebody says something like regulated cannabis, what does that refer to? Is it just like medicinal use, or how does the regulation part, what does that mean, I guess?
Sure. The regulated marketplace, in my mind, is the, I guess now 29 states that have medical marijuana laws, as well as I think we're up to 8 or 9 states that have adult use cannabis laws. So to me, it's a distinction between the underground market, where you're purchasing cannabis from someone who is not subject to taxation or any type of regulation in the product that they're selling you, and it is all of the transactions are illegal transactions in the eyes of the federal government. So it's not about legality in my mind, it's about the regulations that the distributor has to go through in order to make that sale legally.
Now, we're going to elaborate further on the cannabis industry as a whole, but to kind of bring it back to you as a lawyer and lawyers overall, do you think lawyers are, if you will, behind the digital times? I feel like there's a lot of different sectors and niches and positions that just have still fallen behind and just really haven't quite caught up to things yet. It's kind of like, they're finally excited that they have an iPhone, but, how long has iPhone been out for, and how many people actually own an iPhone now? They tend to be kind of the laggards. So do you think there is this type of concept, I guess, with lawyers, the sense of just being behind on the times? And what challenges do lawyers face in the aspect of digital marketing?
Certainly, I think lawyers are, as a whole, are very resistant to change. In terms of digital marketing, they're certainly behind the times. They're very resistant. There are state bar restrictions on what you can and can't say in attorney advertising, and that's something that lawyers have to be very conscious of. On social media, for example, when you make a statement, you have to make sure that you're not engaging in attorney advertising that's not allowed. So I think that's one challenge. Although I do think there are certain companies who are adapting to the digital world in the legal field. I have a friend from law school who works at a company called Divorcify, and they are. Her story is pretty interesting. She probably would be a good guest for the show, but she lived in New York. She moved to the Boston area, learned how to code, and then she kind of entered the dissection of, or the intersection, I should say, of the divorce world and the digital world. And that's the concept behind Divorcify. I also know of a company out of New York called Lofty. And what they're doing is they are connecting personal injury attorneys to their leads based on, more of a advanced algorithm as opposed to just other ways of lead generation.
Like those lovely TV ads we see every single day?
Exactly, the law offices of James Sokolov. They're moving beyond that. I guess that was the progression from no advertising at all to that. But I also think there are certain areas where technology. I guess this is not so much about digital marketing, but a little bit about technology. I mean, there are areas where they're trying to adapt artificial intelligence to do legal research, and I think it covers all ends of the spectrum, or spans all ends of the spectrum. But I think as a whole, your question is on point. Lawyers are generally behind when it comes to digital marketing, and from my perspective, when I was running a law firm in New York, I used digital methods for all kinds of things. I tried to keep, to the extent that I could ethically, I tried to keep all my files stored in the cloud, and I used a online case management system where I had access to that on my tablet as well as on my phone. I think it helps simplify kind of that business side, although it's still a challenge. And I'm sure there are kind of white shoe law firms who are trying to make themselves more hip. You see them go through. I see just in my work, I come across websites that have been redone countless times over the times that I've followed a firm or been familiar with people who work there. So I think they're maybe spending a lot of money in web design. I remember one law firm that I had some dealings with. They had at one point everybody's picture on the website was a full-size picture of the attorney standing up, and you could, like, you know how you can select an image and like move it around, and you could like move them around as well,
like rotate them.
Yes.
Like
Whoa.
Exactly. It was
cardboard cutout. Now yours for $99 if you go with our company. Nice.
So I think that kind of represents maybe an attempt of trying a little bit too hard to be hip, but certainly the lawyers in general could benefit from smarter digital marketing, I guess.
Do you see at all social media coming into play as a lawyer or working with a firm? Or is there just so much red tape when it comes to, as you mentioned, about what you can say and how you say it and everything else, and you don't want to misrepresent yourself and what you can do? Does that come into play, and can that hinder social media, or do you think that social media can be used and that it could be effective?
I think it is something that's not used very much, and I certainly remember going to seminars put on by the Bar Association when I was living in New York, and the presenters talking about be very careful what you post on social media. And my law school always told us to be conscious of those things because of your digital footprint, I guess, as they call it, and it has come back to bite people before. I think you just have to be responsible about what you're posting on the internet.
We're talking about, again, the impact of words and being careful of what you say and how you say, especially in law. But it's especially important in the cannabis industry, too. I mean, we have, for instance, marijuana, medical cannabis, hemp, cannabis indica, cannabis sativa, THC, CBD. There's so many terms out there right now, and you have to be careful with how you market and what you use and so forth. So with this, what do they all mean? As simple as you can make it of a summary, what do these actually mean, and what are the differences, especially when it comes to legal implications?
Sure. Cannabis, ironically, is, almost as bad as the government these days with abbreviations and acronyms. It's mainly people use the term cannabis instead of the term marijuana because of the origins of the term marijuana, and there's a lot of historical evidence that it was a term that was created with racist underpinnings around the time when marijuana prohibition was coming into place. Up until that point, cannabis had been used in tincture-like medications for, thousands of years, but in the United States for many, many years, it was when doctors used to carry those big black bags, cannabis tincture was often one of the medications that was in there. So the racial underpinnings of the creation of the term marijuana, in that was something that the Mexicans were using, and it certainly has a different connotation than cannabis. The purpose of that was twofold. It was to identify the substance with those individuals, as well as kind of remove all the references to cannabis and that same substance in terms of. So that's kind of a little bit of the history of those terms. I prefer to use the term cannabis because it's the scientific name, and we're talking about a plant, and it it's a little part that I can do to help eliminate the racist term of marijuana. But for all intents and purposes, the terms are they're interchangeable. Cannabis typically grows in two different forms, the indica plant and the sativa plant, and they have different physical characteristics, as well as the cannabinoids inside of those plants have different effects upon the endocannabinoid system. Generally, we're just at the kind of very, very beginning of research on cannabis, and I think as we find out more, we'll be able to distinguish them more. But THC, for example, is the psychoactive cannabinoid that is present in the cannabis plant. CBD is a more recently discovered cannabinoid, and that's non-psychoactive and has gotten a lot of publicity recently in the last couple of years as being very effective to treat children who have seizure disorders that are difficult to treat. It also has very specific medicinal properties when it comes to anti-inflammatory properties and so on and so forth. There are hundreds of cannabinoids, though. I mean, we're really talking about these chemical components on a very molecular level. So there are hundreds of them, and the terms kind of in the cannabis industry become very technical. One chemical component right now that's very popular is called terpenes. They exist in many other plants and fruits and vegetables as well. They're the naturally occurring aspects that give the plant its smell. One common one is limonene, and that obviously also exists in lemon and other citrus. And that terpene, its chemical profile has the effect of increasing energy in many individuals. So, and the more I learn about the cannabis plant, I think that while the focus has been on the cannabinoids, that the terpenes may actually be the chemical components that we should be targeting. So we're really at the very, very, very beginning of not only regulated cannabis, but also cannabis research, because of the difficulty in doing research on a federally illegal substance, especially in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. It's very challenging and is really one area that will hopefully the ease of doing research will increase. And as we learn more about the plant, we'll have more of these terms, actually. So we'll just add to the kind of cannabis vernacular. Although I certainly your point is well taken. I mean, we could probably have an entire podcast just about cannabis terminology.
I'm sure there's already one out there, but it's like alcohol, right? I mean, there's different kinds. And I know nothing really about all the differences per se, other than just the names. But there's whiskey and
bourbon and
vodka and all this other stuff, And so I think this along the same way, the more we find out about something, the more beneficial it is to have a clear definition of, okay, well, what is it exactly that we're talking about, instead of just clumping it all together into, well, it's this thing, well, yeah, it's just alcohol or it's just cannabis. But hopefully in the future, it'll be nice to, as this industry gets
more mature,
it'll be nice to kind of get a better understanding that way too. I think like this was very enlightening for me, and I think for some of our listeners out there who, still sort of have that quote stigma unquote on marijuana, it can be like you were mentioning, it's the scientific name for it is cannabis, and is like a whole there's a whole thing behind it. It's not just this mysterious drug that
that is being sold in just dark alleys and things like that. There's no sketchy person per se that would be selling it when it's legal, for example.
Exactly, and that kind of bringing it into the regulated market serves that purpose as well. We strive to eliminate that stigma, because people have used cannabis for a variety of reasons for thousands and thousands of years. And your point, Tatiana, is well taken, because as we learn more about it, we need to be more careful in how we talk about it, because people often are say medical marijuana as a term, as if it's this, medical substance. And while I like to say that cannabis is very therapeutic to people, kind of medical marijuana is different than adult use marijuana, only in the sense that it, depending upon the municipality or state, it's more it can be more potent, it can be targeted for specific reasons, but the plant is the plant. And so people often get confused because they're like, oh, how can the medical marijuana be so helpful for so many different things, and how is it this kind of magical cure-all? And as you learn more about kind of how we intake it into the body, or how it's distributed throughout the body, it makes a lot more sense. There's a system within our body that has receptors for chemical aspects of cannabis, the cannabinoids, and the terpenes. I mean, these receptors are kind of distributed throughout our system. So throughout all the biological systems of the body. So biologically, it makes more sense when you think about it in that way. So it's not as if it is this magical cure-all. It is in many ways it improves the kind of overall function of the body. And when there are people who have systems in their body that aren't functioning properly, it helps them to return to that proper functioning. And there are all different kinds of theories about how that works. And again, we're at kind of the very beginning of discovering all of that. But it's certainly exciting, and certainly it will have many more different names. But there are, I would make one distinction with alcohol in the sense that those are, distilled beverages the majority of the time, whereas different strains or cultivars, as some people call them, of cannabis are naturally occurring. Well, they have, the genetic. There's a lot of genetics and breeding behind it, and they have been, bred together, and in many ways they've been bred to have the highest content of THC, which if we ultimately find out that that's not exactly, how it works, well, that is, the most psychoactive of the substances, it may not be the most beneficial. And that's something that we'll discover, and hopefully, we'll have geneticists and breeders who are able to breed the type of plant that we're looking for specific ailments or diseases.
And now there are many people who are currently selling it one form or another, especially depending on the state that you're in and for what reasons. And then you also have it also like in the pet market, for instance, a lot of oils and capsules and things like that you can give your pets for anti-inflammatories, you mentioned, in a few other cures. And, with this, though, what I've learned, because I know with Tatiana, she was actually getting some for her cat. And so she's doing some research into it, and she's looking into it. And it's interesting because a lot of these pet companies that sold it online, like these oils and whatnot, they ended up all getting hit probably all at once around 2014, 2015 by the FDA. And so they put the letters online, the FDA does, when they send it out to someone so that it's open to the public. And basically they were saying that these people were using the terms incorrectly, or they were using terms that they shouldn't have been. Like, they shouldn't be saying it will cure, but it could have an impact on this. So they had to be very careful with their phrasing. So my question really is then, how can businesses, at least right now, implement successful marketing without getting attacked by, let's say, the FDA? I'm guessing it's probably kind of similar to what you were saying about lawyers, where it's like, well, you have to be very careful about what you say, and you walk a fine line, basically. So is this pretty much the same case? And if so, what can they do?
Sure. Yeah, my best advice is to hire good counsel who's familiar with the area. There are, many attorneys who focus. I think what you're referencing is the CBD pet market, and what was going on in those instances is exactly what you said. The FDA didn't go after them because CBD is classified in Schedule 1, which it is, because the Controlled Substances Act makes makes no distinction amongst the cannabinoids other than for some synthetic cannabinoids there's a drug called Marinol and Drabinol, and there are other that are in lower schedules because they have been developed in a laboratory. So it makes some distinction, but the naturally occurring cannabinoids, it doesn't make a distinction. So the irony is the FDA didn't go after them because of that. They went after them because they were making a medical claim and did not have the necessary information to support that. In terms of regulated businesses, we have all kinds of disclaimer on the actual medicine. This is not regulated by the FDA. This is so that's one way, is to have disclaimers, and businesses have to be very careful about giving out medical advice. That's a very highly regulated area as well. What's unfortunate in cannabis is that while the numbers are growing, there aren't a ton of doctors who know about it. So who would you get your information from? Well, you get your information from the employees or the patient associates at the dispensary, and those individuals, while they likely have a great deal of training, they don't have the medical training, and they have to be careful about giving medical advice. So there's as I'm talking myself into this quagmire of laws and regulations, I think understanding the law and understanding the business is truly important, especially in an area where something is illegal. So I have gone on, but I guess the answer really is to have good counsel and really take the time to make sure that your business is compliant in all areas. A friend and mentor of mine used to always say, if your business goes out of business in any other area, you go out of business, you maybe declare bankruptcy, and who knows, become president of the United States. But in the cannabis space, if you commit certain compliance infractions, or you don't place the necessary emphasis on compliance, well, then you could potentially end up in federal prison in an orange jumpsuit, and that's something that I try to emphasize to the businesses that I work with as being extremely important. Is just that difference, and that the first thing. I sit down, and whether I'm consulting with the group or representing them as their attorney, first thing I sit down is explain to them that this is federally illegal, and that's an interesting conversation depending upon who the person is sitting on the other side of the table. I mean, often people realize that, but don't necessarily understand the implications of that. For me, I kind of crossed that bridge long ago, but it does often deter people from getting involved in the business or industry.
Well, I think too, it's kind of a difficult industry to wrap your mind around for many people too, because I feel like the real issue is the fact that it's always kind of been popular in culture, even though it's been illegal, but it's had its power or its kind of emphasis throughout our culture for many, many decades. And then also you have the fact that, well, you have states that are saying, okay, well, you can sell it for this reason or that reason, but yet at the same time, then you have the actual country saying, well, federally this is illegal, and so it's just like, which one of these doesn't belong? It doesn't feel like it mixes together. It's like putting a star peg through a circle hole. And so I can see where, at least from my end, not knowing much about the marijuana, or I should say cannabis industry, understanding that and actually having that really hit home.
That dichotomy is very difficult to explain. It has been, the beginning of litigation. It certainly something is behind, and those of us who work in the cannabis industry think that is the placement of cannabis in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. I mean, in my opinion, it has no business being there with substances like heroin. I mean, we're saying it has no medicinal value by placing it there, but yet, all of these states have passed those laws, and in some ways that shows the beauty of our republic, but also the challenging aspect of it is what happens when those issues come in direct conflict. That is playing out every day in places like Colorado, where they sold approximately $1.2 billion worth of cannabis and generated $200 million for the state of Colorado. And while that $200 million is not a significant amount in the multi-billion dollar budget that they have there, it's still money that didn't exist before. And not only that, it's money that was going into the hands of nefarious individuals or groups, including cartels and gangs, and now it's going into the hands of individuals who are trying to operate their businesses by the rules and paying taxes and all of the things that businesses in any other industry do. Unfortunately, there are still many challenges for those businesses, including access to banking, certain provisions of the tax code that make their tax burden extremely high because they can't deduct certain expenses, and so it's and again it's that kind of state federal conflict or that really is the genesis of that.
It sounds like if somebody does want to get into the industry, they do have to have a passion for it, and it's something that they have to really understand what they're getting themselves into.
You can't even look at it just from a business perspective at that point, but also from a social perspective. Understand what it does for society and the impact of having regulations on something like this, depending on your belief of how it should be regulated and whatnot. But just having that impact on society, I think you have to have that understanding and appreciation. Otherwise, you're just going to have a huge headache on your hands.
It's certainly not a get rich quick scheme. They talk about the green rush in many places. Well, like most small businesses, these businesses struggle, to become profitable, and not only are they faced with the obstacles that any businesses are faced with, they're faced with these additional obstacles that we talk about, and what you do find is that many of the people are in the industry for yes, they see it as a way to make a living, but it's that passion and that kind of the overused term social entrepreneurship. But you're absolutely right, Evan. I mean, that's what drives it. You have to have that additional passion, or else there are so many other ways to make a living. That's the way that I feel about it, and it's I guess it kind of ties into my old criminal defense days, in the sense that it's kind of like we are fighting back against the government because we believe not only that these policies are incorrect, but that they've had a huge negative impact on society in terms of the disproportionate way that our drug war has affected people of color. I mean, it's really it's mind-boggling when you think about it and look at the statistics and just the number and the effect that has upon those communities of color when they're whatever the percentage of males are no longer there. They're in jail for a non-violent drug offense. That now in many states is legal, and now we're grappling with that within the cannabis industry. The diversity of it is a big issue and kind of hot button issue these days, because we're taking this substance that mostly men of color have been put in jail for, and now allowing a bunch of white men to sell it and make money. And it's sad in many ways. And all different kinds of communities are looking for ways to make the industry more inclusive of not only communities of color but also women, and just making it a better kind of snapshot of society or cross section of society, and hopefully those will come to fruition. A lot of those ideas. There's certainly a number of organizations that encourage women to become active in the cannabis industry and try to support them in their endeavors, as it's for the most part been predominantly a male-dominated industry. Although those numbers are changing. I think a lot of people see it as an opportunity to get involved in an industry before any type of glass ceiling, so to speak, exists, because there's no ceiling. I mean, we're taking something that had no rules, and we're going to governments and voters and saying, look, we want to regulate this, and we want to ensure that the products that we're distributing are safe for people to consume, and that these businesses are becoming contributing members of society.
Now, let's say that somehow, miraculously, with the administration that we have, that we see further progress with the cannabis industry. Can you picture maybe in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, again, depending on the administration that we have, what do you see as the future of cannabis from this point forward? So will there be canna cafes on every street corner, THC-imbued drinks at the local pub? Will marketing for these products be easier or harder? What are your thoughts on this?
I think all of those things are possible. I think one thing that we'll see is more specialized uses in delivery systems. So you see people, they're already developing topicals and transdermal patches and lip balms and all different kinds of delivery systems, whether sublingual sprays or the list of delivery systems is probably almost as long as the list of terms that we were talking about earlier. So certainly I think that as laws change and as more voters and legislators decide that cannabis is something that is going to be taxed and regulated, and that we have that normalization effect in society, which, as you reference, kind of already exists, like when most kids, smell cannabis when they're old enough to realize what it is, they're like, oh, it smells like Uncle Frank. And and that's really they have certainly a olfactory reference point for it before they, have this negative stigma associated with it. So I think part of the point of normalization is just to eliminate that negative stigma, especially when it's unfounded. It's stigmatized for reasons that are not valid. And I think that, at this time, maybe more than any others, it's our civic duty to hold our leaders to task and really make sure that the policies that are being instituted have underpinnings in fact and science, and this is an area where hopefully that progress will continue. Having said that, you don't end 70 years of marijuana prohibition overnight. So I think initially, to go back to your question, marketing is challenging. There are very strict advertising restrictions in the majority of states that have both medical and adult use cannabis laws. And social media is an area where businesses are able to that way, but the market as a whole will be better. Reaching those individuals will likely be better, but because of that, the margins in the business will probably be thinner as the business progresses. We're at this interesting point now where a lot of the prices are still kind of associated with the underground market prices, and those prices there's really no reason for the price to be that way. So as the plant becomes more of a commodity, which it is, it's a plant, it's an agricultural product, I think we'll see a huge price adjustment. And they've already seen that to a certain extent in Colorado and in Washington to a lesser extent. Then marketing becomes really important. Then it really becomes about brands and delivery systems, and as we have more outlets for it, the Canna cafes that you reference may not be so far off in Massachusetts, especially under the Act to Tax and Regulate Marijuana. There is that ability for cities and towns to opt into that type of activity, and I think that you certainly will see, and we're already seeing THC infused beer crossovers, or beer that's brewed with cannabis, or cannabis that is included in wine, or just again the litany of delivery systems, and pretty much anything that you can think of, people are putting cannabis in or experimenting with whether or not that would be a good delivery system.
So that's awesome. I'm just gonna get in on that now at the start.
Just open up your own cafe right now.
Hey, cats, cannabis.
Cats and Cannabis. That sounds like a perfect cafe.
Right? They actually have speaking of cats, they actually have a cat cafe in New York City, and you go there, you get a cup of coffee, and you can also adopt a cat while you're there. Like, it's huge, So as we're at this sort of crossroads of change, Charles, what would you say to people who want to sell cannabis or products, containing certain cannabis ingredients, or saying this completely wrong here probably, but, what should they absolutely keep in mind as they start their business or while they scale their business? And we sort of touched on a few different things throughout, but what would you say is kind of like the most number one, number two sort of thing that they should keep in mind?
My perspective might be a little biased given that I am in the compliance business, but I think compliance is paramount. Again, I made reference earlier to the fact that if your business fails or you make a mistake in this business, the consequences could be dire. Whereas, for other businesses, that doesn't exist. So I think compliance is paramount. And I also think thinking about economies of scale is important, because this is an agricultural commodity, and the kind of current way in which it's cultivated and produced really has its beginnings in the underground market. Your priorities in the underground market were, number one, evading the authorities. Whereas in the regulated market, your priorities, they should be, more about profit margins and making money. I mean, I shouldn't say that. In the medical industry, it's, largely focused on helping people. And you do see unbelievable stories of people who have, bottles and bottles, Ziploc baggies full of painkillers and opioids, and them just trading all of those in for cannabis, essentially. And it's amazing. So to go back to that kind of dichotomy that exists between the underground market and the regulated market in terms of priorities, having a business in the regulated market, you have to think about scale and what your next step is going to be, and how you're going to increase capacity, and how you're going to improve margins, and how you're going to put the best product out there in order to stay relevant in a business that's going to become hyper competitive. I was just in Colorado for a conference last week, and there are many cannabis businesses there. It's a competitive marketplace, and having lived there myself, it was really interesting to go back and visit, because it's going to the one of the stores and purchasing cannabis is in many ways just as commonplace a thing to do as purchase laundry detergent. It really is that much ingrained in society. I hope that one day it will be that same way here in Massachusetts. I don't know. I think there's a little bit of that manifest destiny in the western states, where they have a bit of a different culture when it comes to cannabis or life in general in many ways. And part of what we're trying to do here in Massachusetts especially is break down those kind of puritanical rules that are not necessarily relevant in today's society. I don't know if that really answered your question, but...
Oh, no, it does. It does. And actually, just a quick point on what you said, I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to make a profit. I mean, at the end of the day, a business has to be sustainable, right? Even if you got into it to try to help people, you have to sustain yourself to continue to try to help people. So, I think that's totally fair to say.
Certainly. And I think more of the adult use businesses are, and again, I think that, medical marijuana is invaluable, but I also think that oftentimes, again, as I mentioned earlier, people think of this medical marijuana as a cure-all. Well, people use cannabis therapeutically, in my mind, whether they're using it as a responsible adult or they're using it as a medical patient under a doctor's authorization. There are many people who use wine therapeutically. That phrase, "Oh, I really need a drink," or "I really need a glass of wine," is because that person is seeking some type of therapeutic benefit or perceived therapeutic benefit from that substance. And ultimately, maybe I would say in our lifetimes, we'll live in a society where people will be getting close to the end of work and people say, "Man, I am really looking forward to that joint," and and that will be fine, as it should be. Cannabis is a very, very therapeutic and beneficial substance to many individuals. As I explained to my wife's nephew earlier this year or last year, when he asked me about, I think he said to me, "Is cannabis good for you?" He really put me on the spot, and I said, "Well, like anything else, it can be good and bad for you. Like anything else, it certainly can be abused, but I think understanding the difference between responsible use and abuse is important for anyone in any of the substances that they put into their body, whether that be caffeine or tobacco. These are substances that are not as demonized as cannabis. In fact, encouraged, or tobacco, more recently has been discouraged, but not as demonized as cannabis, but objectively more harmful in my mind. And I think as we discover more and more about cannabis, we'll see how much more harmful those substances are.
Well, Charles, thank you so much for being on our show. It has been truly enlightening to find out all this information. And for our listeners, check out all of the different links that we have in our resources underneath in our description. We'll have a link to a lot of different things that we've talked about today as well, if you are interested in learning more. Also, information on how to contact Charles if you have a more in-depth question he can help answer as well. And remember to like and subscribe our podcast. We are on SoundCloud, iTunes, Player FM, Stitcher, all of the places. We are also on Facebook.com/BranchOutPodcast, all one word. So feel free to share your thoughts and comments on the topics that we've had, topics that you want to hear more about. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And till next time, thanks for joining us for this episode and have a great week.